So, just in terms of introductions, Tom Baker is the Deputy Dean and the William Maul Measey Professor of Law and Health Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He's one of the nation's preeminent scholars in insurance law, exploring insurance, risk, and responsibility using methods and perspectives drawn from economics, sociology, psychology, and history. Professor Baker is the author of a number of books, papers, and book chapters spanning topics as broad, as far-ranging as tort reform, medical malpractice, corporate governance, and financial regulation. Among them, his latest book, Enduring Corporate Misconduct, examines relationships among directors and officers, liability insurance, corporate governance, and securities regulation. Professor Baker's current research seeks to use insights from behavioral economics to improve financial services regulation. He's also the reporter for the ALI's Principles of Liability Insurance Project and is active in the Law and Society Association. Frank Upham is the Wilf Family Professor of Property Law at NYU Law School. Professor Upham has a long and intimate history with Asia. He has spent considerable time at various institutions in Asia, including as a Japan Foundation Fellow and visiting scholar at Doshisha University in 1977, as a research fellow of the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science at Sophia University in 1986, and as a visiting professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing in 2003. He speaks Chinese and French as well as Japanese. Much of his scholarship, however, is focused on Japan, and his book, Law and Social Change in Post-War Japan, which I mentioned Professor Upham has been on my shelf for about 30 years now, received the Thomas J. Wilson Prize in 1987 from Harvard University Press. The book is generally viewed as the standard for reference for discussions of Japanese law and its social and political role in contemporary Japan. More recently, Professor Upham has begun researching and writing about Chinese law and society and about the role of law in social and political development more generally. Professor Upham was the faculty director of NYU's Global Law School program from 1997 to 2002 and is the founder and co-faculty director of the Global Public Service Law Project, which brings activist lawyers primarily from the developing world for an LLM in public services law. So with that, I will turn it over to Tom. And
okay, my main job is going to just be giving a little overview, introduction to the book, give you a sense of its significance in the context of contemporary legal research and legal theory, and I have a few substantive comments beyond that, but that's less important. So I'm going to talk about collateral. I'm going to talk about this book as an example of ethnography. I'm going to talk a little bit about Annelise's ideas of legal techniques and the significance of that. A couple of her case studies that she uses to illustrate this, and then the kind of theoretical and sort of scholarly fancy contribution that she makes is to Realism Reloaded. For those of you Matrix fans out there, I'm a big Matrix fan, so we have the Reloaded, the Realism, the new and better version, but Neo is still there. Okay, so Annelise, the book is a play on words that reflects sort of two different ideas of collateral. That one idea of collateral is a private regulatory technique that involves, if I don't trust you to perform on your deal, I get you to deposit the value of the deal to me with someone else, with Annelise. And that's collateral, that you've pledged and that I have the right to grab it if you don't do what you promised to do. And that is often, and I think Annelise wouldn't disagree, correctly understood as a kind of private regulatory technique. But collateral also has this sort of interesting sense of to the side, not direct. Think about collateral damage in war. And the idea of collateral knowledge is, this is obviously knowledge about collateral, but that this is knowledge that's a little bit to the side, indirect, and that she identifies that many of the ways in which lawyers and law interact with financial regulation is to the side, indirect, in this way. So that's collateral knowledge. And collateral is the private regulatory technique that she's excavating and understanding and examining and picking up in 50 different ways and looking at. Her methodological technique is ethnography. And ethnography is, I don't want to say it's the opposite of econometrics or microeconomic or economic theory, but ethnography involves entering the world of the participants. And Annelise spent years, and I know from my own life, is still friends with some of her subjects, really entering into the world of the regulators who she was seeking to understand. In Japan mostly, but a little bit entering the world of the, more historically, the world of the drafters of the UCC that she uses as a case study. And that ethnographic research it's deep. You're trying to get kind of very far into the understanding of the world, of the people that you're investigating. And it's also wide, in the sense of wide, encompassing understanding their world in all its aspects, insofar as a researcher is able to do that. And it's really and it's not, I mean, I'll just pick on economics because it's fun to pick on economics because they're so hegemonic. It's not thin. It's not, and it's definitely not narrow. And by thin, she's not trying to isolate a particular stratum of the world that she's investigating. She's really getting both deep and wide. And the research technique it's qualitative. She talks to these people. I imagine she had ideas of what she was going to talk to them about, but it's quite clear that her ideas that she was going to talk to them about were provisional, were guesses, and that they changed radically through the course of the relationships that she developed with her subjects. And that she's always engaged in the interpretation. It's not, pull your sample, analyze the data, then interpret it. The whole process is interpretive, constantly. And it's humanistic. I mean, it's a science. I think I don't want to abandon the word science here, but it's a humanistic science. It's a science that's seeking to understand the role of travel in Sato's life, so that we understand. There's this great little paragraph that I'm sure it probably at one point, Annelise was wondering whether it was going to survive the cutting room floor. But there's this point in which we meet one of the several Satos in the book, which I guess is that like John Doe? Yeah. Okay. So we meet Sato, who is a back office person who's responsible for collecting the forms that the traders fill out and making sure that they fit into the ISDA norm. And he communicates with his counterpart in Tokyo, in London or New York. But we find out that what Sato really likes to do is to travel. And there's this thing. So we get a sense of knowing of the people that she's interviewing. And this sort of thing is incredibly important as a reader, because you then think, wow, she really knows these people. Like, not only did, so if he confesses to her in a way that my life, that I'm really Superman, not Clark Kent, in a way, it's like, so therefore we come to understand that when he talks to her about the transition from from defined time to real time, I'll explain what that is in a minute, that we get the sense that she really got the real deal because she got him. So, all right, so it's collateral. All right, now what Annelise does, I would say the main theme of the book, apart from the Realism Reloaded, is she identifies the regulatory practice that she's investigating as being the application of legal techniques. And so this is not a complete list, but that there are committees. The committees is referred, the collateral that she's investigating, many of the rules governing this are established by something called the ISDA, which is the International Swaps and Derivatives Association. And they have committees that create documents. They have protocols that one follows. They create forms. And then this was a new one. I mean, so the committees, protocols, form creation, I had those down as legal techniques. But Annelise persuaded me that filling out the form is a legal technique, and that she explains And then, so there's committees, protocols, form creation, the creating of standard forms, form completion, the filling out of standard forms. The placeholders is the word that Annelise would like us to use as a broader category that would include things like legal fictions. Analogical reasoning, what we do, we reason by analogy, and there's a great part in the book where she explains how netting is made legal in Japan by being analogized to something that I don't understand, but it was true. And then another category is a category of another legal technique is a kind of so placeholder is a new term that Annelise invented that I think is I'll explain in a bit. I think a good contribution. And then a statute with a hollow core. That's a statute where the legislature sets the framework but leaves the regulators to define the key terms. And then she has this concept of winding, or she has a concept of unwinding, which is where you take bureaucratic control, you decouple or unwind bureaucratic control from a specific set of activities. And I think that one could also wind, although you're investigating unwinding. And through this, what she illustrates is how sort of politics, policy, judgment become technical activity for experts and not necessarily technocrats, which is her word for the people in government, but for experts sort of distributed, for you guys, those of us who teach you and those of you, the experts. And she shows how these techniques limit, at least the ones she's investigating, limit the need for trust and for knowledge and create a kind of virtual sociality, which is a replacement for the kinds of connections and trust and knowledge that understand. And she also, and I will confess to having resisted this idea for long, when Annelise and I have been talking about this for a long time, resisted this idea until I found it in myself, that there's this kind of aesthetic pleasure in the good legal technique that we all, I remember when I was in law school in law review at 1 o'clock in the morning thinking, wow, I am having a blast. And then thinking, what is wrong with me? But so that there is this kind of pleasurable aspect to this that's very important to the meaning of the people engaged in it. All right, she investigates this through a variety of really three main case studies. One, she looks at this is more historical, she looks at how the UCC, Uniform Commercial Code, invented a category called secured transactions and explained how that was an effort to make law like the reality of the lawyers involved, one of whom was Carl Llewellyn, who of course was deeply aware of and had done ethnographic research. She looks at the Japanese approach to netting, and netting is the idea of offsetting one's obligations when at either the time of bankruptcy, and she investigates two different ways in which two different kinds of legal academics / policymakers attempt to make white things white. And the idea of making white things white is that these people all had the view that netting simply had to be permissible under Japanese law, but it was a problem, it was a project to understand how it was permissible. So it was white, we had to make it white. And Shindo used analogical reasoning, and Kanda used a statute, tried to develop through a statute with a hollow core. And she looks at both. So we see this idea of how a project, this making something that had to be netting was legal under Japanese law, became sort of assumed the answer, and then made it into a project that was a legal expert project, not a policy or judgment or law or politics project. And then the other thing she investigates is that from designated time net settlements to real-time gross settlements. And what these two super technical terms relate to is intraday transactions between banks that are engaged in all these deals with each other such that at different points in the day they could owe each other $1 billion. And to manage this problem, historically they had used something called designated time net settlements, which is at specific times each day they would decide that everything took place. And so at that time, if between those 2-hour segments one person was red and the other was in the black for like $2 billion, it didn't matter, that everything was collapsed to that one time. And people didn't like that because it meant that if someone went bankrupt in between those two periods, there would be one of them would be left holding the bag. And so they had this great unwinding technique of going from a designated time net settlement to a real-time gross settlement, which meant that, think of it like mark to market, that at every moment, every transaction was supposed to be between an entity that had the money to the entity that needed the money. And, of course, it turns out this is impossible. So what they did was they wrote a computer program that had an algorithm that deemed things to have been taken place in the way that meant that everyone always had the money that they needed. And so that was real time. It was real time gross settlement. No netting, no offsetting, no whatever. But of course the way they did it was through a fiction, through a legal placeholder that made it as if everything. And the as if moment is as if is a very key idea in Annelise's book. And so I'm not even remotely doing justice to this, but you have to read it, and then you'll know what TTNS and RTGS, and you can talk in code, and it'll be fun. All right, now, the big kind of theoretical contribution that, and methodological contribution that Annelise is making is trying to kind of help us reload realism. And of course, by realism, we need legal realism, Carl Llewellyn, Morris Cohen, all these guys that we heard about. And she wants to, and that realism got us the law in action, not the law on the books. It got us norms, not positive law. And she says she wants for us to replace to supplement the idea of a norm with a technique. That these legal techniques, that they're what's happening in the world, those are not really norms. They're just projects. And that doesn't mean that there might not be norms somewhere in the picture, but that the idea of norms isn't doing enough to explain what it means when some expert takes over a project and makes it work. She wants to not replace the idea of the real as I'm going out in the field and I'm figuring out what's really happening, but to say that the gap there's not like the gap, that there's not only a gap between law and the real, that the law that actually happens out there in the world is not necessarily the law on the books, but it's not reality in the kind of go out and look at it under a microscope sense. It's full of these placeholders, these things we do to make the world as if it worked in the way that it was supposed to. There's dreams. People have ideas about how they want the world to be, and that those ideas animate what they do in a way that is not realistic in the sense of, my dream takes me to where I'm going. And then there's these statutes with hollow cores, and a statute gets enacted that it says that we're going to, think about the Affordable Care Act that we just enacted. We're going to have essential health benefits. So that's great. What's essential health benefits? Well, I don't know. Ask the Secretary of Health and Human Services. We've passed something that means everyone's going to have something that is going to be defined later. And that's the idea of a statute with a hollow core. It's not bad. It's a way of assigning, allowing there to be a political claim of having accomplished something while leaving the expert, the project, the technique to decide what that something is. I started, when I first did this, and her way of investigating is not top-down, it's bottom-up, and that law and life and the world happens, and she tells us not top-down, or not only top-down, but also bottom-up. And then she's got a lot of theory of practice, but she's also investigating a practice of theory. Something that I haven't talked about was how you see in the book how this unwinding, and unwinding is a metaphor for sort of deregulation, taking the law out, although as the designated time to the real-time example shows, it's never out. But and she explains how the ideas of theory, and Hayek is her theoretician of choice, because he's captivated the Japanese bureaucrats who are doing the unwinding. So she's got a practice of theory, how theory actually works in the world and changes people. And then she wants us, and she herself does, return to the idea of law as a craft, and that my little play on putting the expert back in expertise, that sort of expert agencies, it's not like there's just this expertise, this sort of vague thing, that there's experts. There's people who are experts and who behave in a certain way and who you can understand and investigate and talk to, that they're there. That expertise is not something dry and abstract. It's people that are experts. And then finally, what she's trying to do is to reconstruct legal formalism and reconstruct in the sense of, rebuild, help us understand the appreciation for, and so that's what collateral knowledge does. I have a couple comments of my own, which are sort of on the nature of, the cherry on the top of the of the whipped cream on top of the sundae that's already perfectly made. But one of the things that Annelise is saying, and this is picking up on realism, is there's public-private. I mean, come on. She shows that designated time net settlement to real-time gross settlement was supposed to take the government out. Well, and give it to the private people. Well, the private people turned out they need. The government's not out. The government's there. The government, and so my one little is I think using collateral, I think that the private's even more public than I would have emphasized a little more that that law and these are kind of technical, but that when I pledge collateral to you, I get to still count it as an asset. Well, that's a legal rule. And if I didn't get to do it, I'd be much less willing to give you collateral if I didn't get to count that collateral in my books as an asset. It's law that exempts collateral from the bankruptcy rules. It's law that allows rehypothecation. Rehypothecation is I give you something to hold for collateral, then you can go do something else with it. That's what got AIG in big trouble in their life insurance company. And that law allows netting. Law allows us at the time of, when you go bankrupt or you're having trouble, that I can subtract. You can subtract from what you owe me what I owe you, rather than having you pay me all, and then other goes into it. So all this is law. And that collateral is understood as a private form of regulation that is just completely constructed by law. And then I would say that collateral is even more a placeholder. That Annelise nicely describes how collateral limits the need for trust. I don't need to know you or trust you if I've got your stuff, and if you don't deliver, I just grab it. But it accelerates the collapse from the loss of trust, because it means that in AIG is an example that AIG had to give less collateral than everyone else because it was AAA rated. But once it stopped being AAA rated, all of a sudden, like circuit breakers kicked through everyone. It went from being AAA to being practically insolvent. If it weren't for the government, all of a sudden, so that it's even more an as-if world, perhaps, than she. I mean, she certainly knows this. I would have just maybe emphasized it a bit more. So I'm going to close with the picture of the collateral knowledge, and so Annelise. This is Annelise looking in, and then she's looking out, and giving us the sense of both what the world looks like looking into the world that she's investigating, but then also what the sense of what it looks like from the inside looking out. And tell me what the stuff.
I'm going to ask Annelise 3 questions, but first in sort of increasing levels of complexity, I think. Could be wrong. The first one is Annelise talks about a distinction between the technology in private and public settings. I will make references to pages, which you don't have, I know. But, and I now see that there's actually a book out, and I was stuck with a review copy, but I'm not resentful at all. She's promised me. She says on page 34, when one begins, because as Tom said, a large part of this book is about the interaction between public and private, but it's mainly showing the public side of the private. And I sort of want to talk about in a distinction between technique and technology. And since Tom's incredibly comprehensive. I didn't need to read the book if I just come listen to your presentation. But one thing that I want to emphasize from the book is the distinction that Annelise makes between technique and technology and technocracy, which I thought was extremely helpful. So the technique is what Tom, in the slide with a long list of things, starting with a committee and the creation of the form and the completion of the form and so on. This is technique, and his reference to law review at 1 a.m. I was never on law review. I could never see the point to it. But now I see sort of this is, you learn the aesthetics of legal practice there. I had to learn it on the job. The technique of going through the stuff and crafting like a good model airplane or something and getting it done. It may not appear to have any use, but just the doing of it is important. And it gives you a sense of who you are and what your role and what the role of what you're doing is in society. And that's contrasted with technocracy, which is appearing to use technique and technology from the top down to shape a situation in which technique will occur. And this is my first question. It seems that Annelise sees the technique as occurring in the Bank of Japan or in the back offices of these places, and technology occurring elsewhere. But my question is there a distinction between private and public as the use of technique and technology and the use of technocracy? Is one place, is there planning, and the other place there's implementation and aesthetics, or do both of these exist in both places all the time? So that's the first question. The second one is not so much a question, it's a comment, and I'm here for my knowledge of Japan. So I thought it would be appropriate to talk about a little bit about Japan. And Annelise describes this hollow statute that Tom described to you, and it's fascinating. It's basically, I think if I read it correctly, it's the political, theoretical, ideological imperative to get the government out of the system. That's the unwinding that Tom describes. So instead of having the government involved in designated time,
Designated
time net settlements and replace it with real-time gross settlements, you have to get the government out. Okay, so you create this statute. And the reason the statute says that all these things are going to happen, real-time gross settlements, which is the government not out of it. It's not the government setting designated times during the day when, 3 p.m., 8 p.m., when all of the settlements will be done. It's the private parties doing it in real time by themselves. And the statute says real-time gross settlement, more or less, real-time gross settlement will be what the government says it will be. And everybody's satisfied. Oh, good. The government's out of it. That was supposed to be a laugh line. I mean, in other words, the government's not really out of it. The government is even perhaps just as centrally located and perhaps more discretion than they had before. But I mean, I may be misreading this, and this seems to me an absolutely well-established legislative skill of the Japanese and maybe of everyone else. But I know Japan best, so I'll give you 3 other examples of hollow statutes or placeholders or legal fictions. Then I want to come back and sort of question whether they are really legal fictions or placeholders or deviously designed techniques to fool the enemy. Annelise talks of them as if they're the kind of neutral, technical, instrumental in the idea of a means to an end, but not political in the sense of a tool to be used against your enemy. And I'm talking here, not about Muammar Gaddafi, but the sort of the forces that you have to juggle. So the first one that I encountered in my study of Japanese was the Petroleum Industry Law. The Petroleum Industry Law said in like 1970 that gasoline companies could import refined gasoline anytime they wanted. In other words, free. All they had to do was just tell the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, we're going to import 7 million gallons of grade something gasoline from such and such refinery in Indonesia. Okay? But nobody ever imported refined petroleum products in Japan because it was against government industrial policy to do so. It's perfectly legal to do it, free. All you had to do was just notify. It's notification statute. But Ministry of International Trade and Industry is known as Measey. Measey set out administrative guidance, which is described in Annelise's book, and getting rid of administrative guidance is part of the unwinding idea. And would send out administrative guidance saying that no one can import refined gasoline except Japanese domestic refiners. In other words, no one can sell donuts except Dunkin' Donuts. And therefore, Dunkin' Donuts will control the sale of that. The United States got upset about this, and they said you have to liberalize this. This is before WTO, I think, or at least before I was aware of WTO. But this was part of, it was GATT maybe. There's some set of rules, and the United States says you're not abiding by them because you don't allow free import. Okay? So the Japanese said, okay, hey, we'll amend the law. Now remember, the law said you can import anytime you want. Okay? The Japanese said, we will amend this law. And the Americans said, good, this is what we want. And they amended it, and the law that came out said that Measey is now authorized to allow people to import refined petroleum products. Of course, they're also authorized to decline to allow people to import refined petroleum products. In other words, it went from a law which said you can import as much as you want. All you have to do is tell the government. You don't have to wait for them to respond. You just send something in, to something where you said you have to apply, you have to show why you need it, and so on and so forth, and then you have to get permission. The American government, which I was watching at this time in wonderment, said another victory for the Trade Negotiating Office. The second one was the large-scale retail stores law, what I like to call the big stores law. And initially, in the 70s, big stores could not open. This is, Walmart. Actually, it started off with department stores, but then it became Walmart. Could not open without a permit. So the Americans didn't like this either, because they wanted Walmart. It wasn't Walmart then, it was Kmart, Sears, and so on. And they wanted them to be able to open. And so Japanese government said, okay, we'll change the statute. And they did change the statute. In this case, it was a real change. And what they did was, they said, they went to the reverse of the petroleum industry statute. They said, this time, we're going to go from a permit system to a completely free system. Large stores can open any time they want, any place they want. Okay. And then it said, but they have to notify the Ministry of International Trade and Industry and receive guidance. Okay. Well, what the government, and this was again trumpeted by the Americans, and I think the Americans actually believe this, which is really amazing to me, that this was going to be a big change. Okay? In fact, what happened was the law was used not only to control department stores, which were the ones that controlled before, but now they controlled all stores. So, and it was, you could open your store freely, but only after you went through a process. The process became that the government would not declare the process completed until the local area small merchants had signed a formal document saying it was okay for the store to open in this form. So this was another victory for American free trade policy. But this is not simply dealing with foreigners. I described yesterday in a talk the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, which was, you can imagine, it was in this case gender, not race, it was gender. And Japanese women from the late 50s, early 60s into the 80s had brought a number of lawsuits against gender discrimination in employment, and they had won almost all of them. And it had established a certain number of doctrine making illegal a certain number of discriminatory practices. Japan, the Japanese legislature then said, after a lot of debate in which they attributed the idea of equality, gender equality employment to foreigners, in this case the United Nations, even though they'd had their own domestic line of cases. So the deception here is not so much of foreigners as of themselves. And they passed a statute which said equality for women in the workplace and made illegal everything that was already illegal and didn't touch anything that this series of lawsuits had not yet gotten to. But what they did say is, henceforth, the government will be taking care of this opening up of equality in the employment sector, thus stopping the employment, these female litigants and attorneys. They took the initiative out of their hands and put it in the hands of the Ministry of Labor particularly. And what happened was the growing equality for women in the employment stopped. And the discriminatory practices which were not yet touched by the litigation, but which the litigation was going towards, such as promotion and hiring, became something which employers had to, quote, try to treat people equally. They just had to try. They didn't have to do anything else. This was trumpeted as a great movement for equality in the workplace. And in my opinion, and I think it's shared by, as I said yesterday, the only people I talked to about this so far have been women attorneys. So they're likely to agree with this, is that actually since the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, women's position in employment has deteriorated. Okay? So we've now got equality on the books, but things have gotten worse. And it's much more complicated than that. But so my question sort of are these statutes hollow? Are they placeholders, which are sort of kind of neutral terms? Or are they well thought out political moves on behalf of particular special interests? I tend to think of it as the latter. And to go to another page reference, Annelise describes her ethnographic discussions with the back office crews, in whom I think she sees the chance of reform. Okay, let me describe first. This is trying to box Annelise in so she can't get out of it with this question, but we'll see how it works. She talks about the futility of trying to change things from the top down, from the technocrats. She wants to change things from the technology people, the people who fill out the forms, and she wants to get a better financial system by dealing with them. And she says this: when these individuals begin to see a wider role they can play in encouraging market reform from the inside, they can become effective advocates and collaborators, skilled navigators of internal institutional politics, expert evaluators of where change is most required and how it might best be achieved for the greater good. Earlier on, she describes a conversation with these back office people in which she says, talking about administrative guidance, and she's talking about how sort of selfless these people are in using their placeholders and legal fictions to get things done, and to get things done in a way that really, make things work better. And she talks to them, my own efforts to test bureaucrats' level of awareness about, here's the important thing, differing effects of particular financial regulations on constituencies other than the large domestic and international banks, in other words, the ones that they're very close to, or the trade-offs in the benefits to one group at the expense of another in a particular pieces of legislation, suggests that the interests of other stakeholders, including smaller players in the financial markets, consumers, employees of financial institutions, and taxpayers, were too diffuse to garner the sustained attention of these regulators. In other words, they were so focused on getting the technique right that, and then she goes on to say, my efforts to probe the effect of the pieces of financial regulation and the perfection of this technique on small banks, consumers, and employees often seem to strike my informants within the bureaucracy as downright odd. So my question to Annelise is, how are we going to get these people who are regulating the entire system at the ground level who haven't even thought about consumers? And I would question whether they were just neutral, filling out the forms, wanting to do the best job, feeling the way Tom did at 1 p.m., at 1 a.m., and, getting it right and good, or whether they really might be doing something a bit more nefarious, which is making sure that financial regulation worked well for precisely the Bank of Japan and the large international and domestic banks, and that it might be they are legal fictions, they may be placeholders, but aren't they also deceptive means to get at a particular self-interested end?
Well, thank you both so much. It's truly humbling to have two people that I've respected for so long and whose work has so much shaped this project take this so seriously. So I really appreciate it very much. I also want to thank Rachel and Donna and Chuck and Eduardo for organizing this. It's I appreciate it very much. And of course, as an ethnographer, I owe an enormous thanks to the people that I worked with, who, sometimes I sit back and think about these people giving of their time as they did, and I wonder what motivated them and if I will do the same for someone else sometime soon. But most of all, I just want to take a second to mark my tremendous debt to Hiro, my husband, who's sitting here in the front. This project is coterminous with our marriage. As I recall, we came up with the idea of starting this just before we got married, and we couldn't get funding from anybody because at that time nobody thought that ethnography had anything to contribute to financial markets. So we said, what the hell, we have some money for our honeymoon, let's just pluck it into doing research. So we went off to the field right after our wedding, and that's how this started. And the companion book to this one is coming out in a few months, and I look forward to celebrating that with him, and of course with our son Xavier, for whom this book is dedicated. So, maybe I just need to take you back for a moment. For those of you who are a little bit younger than I am in this room, probably can't imagine the time around 1996, 1997, when I began this project. The political climate was in some ways quite different than it is now. At that time, financial traders were the top of society. If you were a financial trader, you could do no wrong. You were a genius, you were a wizard. Alan Greenspan was Man of the Year for on Time magazine's cover for saying that markets were entirely self-correcting, and therefore regulation was pretty much superfluous. And this American free market ideology and associated trends in, I would say even in legal scholarship that supported it, were being exported around the world and embraced by avid bureaucrats in Japan as elsewhere who had come to do LLMs on our shores and were taking these ideas back. And as an anthropologist, I think anthropologists' strength is that we're always interested in orthodoxies and understanding, not just fighting against them, but understanding where they come from and why someone would have the ideas that they do. And so it was just fascinating, just as, I imagine at the time of the pyramids, you'd want to know why people build pyramids. I wanted to understand why people believed the things that they believed about the markets before really arguing with them. How did this absolute taken for granted that it was come to be the taken for granted that it is? And so this was really the project. Now, one piece of this was that at that time, law was pretty much of an afterthought. When I took financial regulation as a law student, we spent a lot of time studying economics and not so much time talking about law. In the markets, lawyers weren't the cool guys. The cool guys were the traders. In the academy, I would say I was educated in a time when the practical dimensions of law were pretty much poo-pooed. I learned from Posner on the one hand and critical legal studies on the other to have a lot of disrespect for what lawyers actually do every day, and to think that law is just a product of market forces or political forces or economic, social forces. We'll pick which one you like, but not to care too much about the craft of law. And so, for me, one of the big surprises of this project was learning to pay attention to what lawyers actually do, and what motivates them, maybe even the details of what they do, the art of it, the technique of it, the craft that they may not so much even appreciate or make a big deal out of themselves. And to understand all of that stuff that got lost in my education as just technical gobbledygook, and to see what other work it does. So the argument of the book is, everyone has already explained, is that this technical stuff does much, much more than meets the eye, and probably much more important work for good or for bad than even lawyers realize. And that indeed its humdrum image of itself as, pay no attention to the man behind the screen is part of the trick itself. And so what I'm trying to argue is that, ironically, at this moment as we think about regulatory reform and what kinds of changes we want to see, that we might pay some attention to the role that these techniques are playing. And, again, see whether, even if they've been used in the past in ways that trouble us, we might be able to reappropriate them for other purposes. So, just to respond to your point about aren't these really the tools of some people with vested interests who are really, who know very well what they're doing. They're supporting their industries and who may just simply have no conception of the harm that something like netting is doing. And I've got to say, I completely share your politics on this. And I completely share your interest in how it is that a little thing like a netting law ends up kind of, taking all of the resources away from, the local interests, from the employees to the landowners to all the other parties that may have a stake in bankruptcy, just because there's a little law that says that swap dealers get their pick first, right? So I'm very interested in that. But I think that we've been too quick, those of us on the left, maybe, to equate legal technique with a certain political point of view, that there's no inherent reason why these techniques cannot be used for some other purposes, and that, if you like, we've been too quick to give up control over the game by saying that game equals a certain point of view. So what I'm really interested in, as I think about how we might change our regulation of the global economy after this, at this moment of reform, is whether we might learn from the enemy a little bit here and take back some of the tools of the chess game and use them for other purposes. So that's really the point, I guess, in a nutshell. You had some other questions. And so this goes actually to your point also about whether there's a clear distinction between, does technique equal private for me and technocracy equal public? And I would say, on the whole, to borrow your language, technocracy is a regulatory style, right, in your language. It's a way of being that bureaucrats feel comfortable with. It's the way they do things. But that's not to say that a clever bureaucrat couldn't start thinking like a private lawyer. And I try to show some examples of them doing that. And I think that as we think about how bureaucrats can do better next time around, right, and as we think about reforms of the bureaucracy, and there's a lot of talk about, what does it mean to take, say, the SEC and make it a much more robust organization that has some teeth and can fight back. We want to make this an organization that's not just technocratic, but that also understands the game of legal technique, as the SEC did in its founding moment, for example, when it was so much, populated by really good private lawyers with a progressive agenda. That would be my response. I should say just one last thing. This is a funny, as you probably sense listening to this conversation, it's a funny crossover book because my aim is to make it, that there be something in it that some policy person at Treasury or at the Bank of Japan could enjoy, but that also an anthropology graduate student or someone studying science studies could also enjoy. And I realize that people have different degrees of interest or tolerance for the other. So anthropologists may not want to know very much about the details of financial law, and people at Treasury may not want to know very much about critical theory. And so the challenge of the book has been to strike a balance that everyone can live with up to a degree. But I guess my dream for this project going forward, my true dream would be if each of those audiences got just a little bit more interested in each other. If the anthropologists were to say, technical lawyers are pretty damn cool sometimes. And if the people at Treasury were to say, God, I should go read Foucault. It's not so scary. I can handle this. I could do this. Okay, thanks very much. Thank you. Sorry, I forgot. We're doing questions. Any questions? Yeah, Michael.
Very lightning. I have a puzzle that maybe you can help me with. There's a so the move that you're making, it seems to me, is to say the sort of big. This is a big picture question, right? So the move is to say a lot of what is conventionally thought of as not law really is law, right? And that's similar to moves by people like Ellickson and others, right? Who want to say that, and other people who write about soft law, and say, right. And so that in a way so that's piece one. Piece two is then to say, so when formalists look at this and say, well, that stuff's not law because it's open-ended or because it's just technique or something like that, that's just a very narrow definition of law. If you look at what lawyers do, so much of it is this stuff that's conventionally called not law. It should be called law, right? So you want to move us away from the notion that what the law consists of is some authoritative command of the sovereign, sort of Austinian notion. So, and this seems like a characteristic move of what I'll call the academic left of the last 20 years. Not political left, but academic left. So I was just sort of thinking of that, and I'm puzzled by the relationship of that fact to what I learned from Duncan Kennedy 20-some odd years ago right? Which is, so if you think about his, like, so Duncan Kennedy writes this very influential article in the Buffalo Law Review, and he taught his entire legal history class out of it, which was my worst grade in law school.
Mine was in legal postmodernism, just so we can be even on this.
Yeah, so, so I could be getting it entirely wrong. But right. Kennedy's argument is that the classic move of formalists is to constantly insist on the public-private distinction, and that always privileging the private, right? And so that private law is more important than public law. Within private law, contract is the highest falling, tort less so. And so this strikes me as odd, right? Because so Kennedy wants to critique that and wants to bring back in sort of the public, but the public there is the conventional view of legal norms. Right? He says it's actually he's making the move of saying actually the law is doing a lot of the construction here, but it's the law in the way that you and then Tom were talking about a little bit, which is the law in this sort of conventional sense. So so one possibility is that I just sort of got this all scrambled, but the other possibility is that at some point the sort of critical view of law flipped from taking the view that, oh no, we've got to see conventional regulation in more places than we do and extol that, to saying actually all this other stuff that doesn't look like regulation in the form of commands really is law. So that's my question, whether that's raised by, whether the book provides a new way of seeing that. That's a kind of meta question.
For the regulation of commands.
So regulation of commands is the law that Kennedy wanted to say was everywhere, and that's good, and we ought to be extolling that. Right. Whereas the sort of more contemporary view is to say, no, law isn't about commands. It's not most of it.
Right. Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. So Frank was giving you one message of the book, which is I forget it was the form of the latter, but the idea that there are commands in lots of places, right? Whereas I agree with you. I mean, I think that in addition to that, there's a lot of interest now among me and my friends in how the command isn't the whole game, right? That there might be lots of other aspects of the oomph power of law other than the command. And one version of that that's more conventional that people are used to is the idea that it's the social that's doing the work, right? It's because we're all a clique of insiders, and because, the rules, schmools, who cares, but it's really because you went to law school with me, or you're my cousin, or, whatever that, you're my religion, or whatever the explanation is. And that's one view. I'm trying to say, that social argument actually doesn't explain everything. That there's a lot of stuff it isn't explained by any of this, command or social ties. And that there's something about the craft of doing law itself that draws people in. So one of the things that really interested me about these back office staff is that they didn't necessarily have deep social ties to the people that they were working with. And yet they felt that, when a problem comes up, I can talk to the guy in Bermuda and we can resolve it. And, well, how do you do that? Well, we got the same form, and we've done this a million times, and we fill out the form in the same way. It's not about, I trust him because he's a mensch. It's about, we fill out the form in the same way. So that's a piece of law that I think you see through ethnography that you don't really see so much from legal theory. And that would be a distinction that I would draw with Duncan's work. Although I think Duncan actually loves the aesthetic side of law. He just doesn't want to admit that he loves it, but I think he actually loves it. Yeah?
When I was hearing this, I was thinking of Jerry Lopez, who has, over the years, argued that law schools have no clue about what lawyers do, they're what lawyers do. And it struck me that if you read the ethnography of the people you look at, you will get a particular view of that. But if you look at the ethnography of the kind of Jerry looks at, you get a different. And the example that there aren't a lot of us. And representing a particular tenant against the landlord will do something for that tenant, but not for all the other tenants in the same building about the same problem. So as a lawyer, what you need to do is to organize the tenants. And then you need to get into the theory about organization in order to do that. And if you don't do that, you're not a good lawyer. And the chapters of Rebellious Lawyer, the book, all illustrate themes of getting clients to be able to self-represent. And I'm curious as to whether the vision of law he has there contradicts or just supplements the vision of law. Because it doesn't sound to me like, if you're talking about law, that it's not just command, but it is a regulatory effect. Whereas this it is collateral. It does fit that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very possible that there are many, many flavors and shades of what lawyers do, and that this doesn't by any means stand for all of it. I think that's really important. And, one of the things that's very interesting about the world that I'm describing is that until recently, at least, there was very little litigation. I mean, you could litigate. There were statutes. Why not? No, you just don't do that because nobody wants to have to make the kinds of disclosures about their portfolios and so on that you'd have to do if you actually litigate. It's just not worth it to you, to either side. So there's so taking law without litigation is a very different concept. You're talking about people who have a litigation strategy in mind always, among other things, I imagine.
Well, actually, we have a bargaining strategy.
Right.
With the landlord. That these tenants have to have their needs.
Right. I mean, that said, bargaining and getting people together is a major, major part of the job description of the people that I described. That they almost never, you think of these banks as competing with each other, they almost never make a move on all of this stuff without there being some consensus on what's going to be done and how that consensus gets made, and the complicated mix of government people and bank people who are in the room as the consensus gets made is really fascinating to me. And I would bet that if you and I were to sit down and talk about how he does the work of getting them together, we would find there are certain ways that he does the craft of making that happen that have analogs. They're not identical, but they have analogs in the world of the people that I work with. And I think those are the things, if I had to think about how we redo legal pedagogy, right? Those are the things that we teach all the time without even realizing that we're teaching them, and that are perhaps the lasting bit of what we teach. Yeah.
So I'm interested in what you imagine the book being an ethnography of. So is it an ethnography of law, period, or of financial regulation, or of Japanese financial regulation? And so what's your study set here? How transposable do you understand these conclusions to be general?
Right. I mean, I think that's a good question to any anthropologist, right? How generalizable is what you're describing? I set out to study Japanese law. It quickly became apparent to me that, probably one of the people that was mentioned here, Hideki Kanda, in Tom's presentation, is someone that many of you know, that this idea that it was Japan over there was absolutely preposterous, that the level of connections back and forth between these worlds, but not only between Japan and the US, but between the academy and the market, between the government and what goes on in law school faculties, was just so rich that it became silly. It became its own legal fiction to say I'm studying the Japanese market, and so I had to start putting those other things into the picture, putting myself in the picture, frankly, and so I see Japan as a case study of something larger that has some specific dimensions to it, as Frank was saying, but it also has some aspects that are not Japanese alone by any means. And I would totally echo what you said about this is a very Japanese way of doing things that might be the way everybody does things.
But we just look at Japan, so
knows?
Well, thank you very much for coming on our first beautiful day of the year.